Before I get started with this presentation, I would like to take some time out to thank everyone who has liked and shared my past 2 videos and have subscribed to this channel. The Linux Lifestyle is a brand new channel, and I have a lot to learn about video production and some of the more technical aspects of maintaining a channel. So I'd like to take time to thank you for the well wishes and the positive feedback, and I hope you continue to join me on this journey. Now, with this being said, in our previous upload, we talked about Linux, namely the Linux kernel and Linux-based operating systems, specifically distributions. We also talked about some of the software that you could most likely find within a Linux distribution, and we even mentioned that a lot of the software that's present in these distributions are licensed under free and open source licenses. Anyway, my name is Michael Kornblum, and this channel is named The Linux Lifestyle. The Linux Lifestyle is going to be about Linux, open source software, and how you can put it to use, to get things done. Now, in part 2, we're going to look a little more at what free and open source software is, some of its history, and how it ties in with the Linux ecosystem, as well as how it ties in outside of the Linux ecosystem. But before we get started, let's look at some key terminology. First off, let's look at what a programming language is. A programming language is quite simply a written, human-readable language that is used to tell computers to do things. Now, a program or an application is a set of instructions for computers that is written in a programming language. Now, for the sake of this discussion, there are 2 types of programming languages. The first is the interpreted language. An interpreted language is a language that is translated by a piece of software called an interpreter, which then executes each line of the program one by one at runtime. The second type of programming language is a compiled language. There, the program is translated all at once by a compiler into an executable program. Now, in a compiled programming language, the text that we write that is going to be compiled by the compiler is called source code. So, as you can probably surmise by now, when we say open source, it means that the source code is easily obtainable and available by others. But let's go back a little bit to a time before the open source movement. Let's look at the free software movement. Now, in the early days of computing, we shared the source code we created, much in the same way that students and academians put up their papers for peer review. We looked at each other's work, we shared each other's work, we improved upon each other's work. And in the early years of software development, this is how software evolved. It was not until the late 70s, early 80s, in which proprietary licensed software first started to make an appearance. While proprietary software was common among the world of operating systems, such as Bell Labs' Unix, or Andy Tannenbaum's Minix, or earlier iterations of operating systems such as Multics. The code that we wrote for these operating systems was often freely shared and distributed among computer scientists, programmers, and the like. This would not be formally known as free software until this gentleman, Richard Matthew Stallman, first came into the picture. Now, RMS worked for the Artificial Intelligence Labs over at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also known as MIT. His job was basically to maintain and improve upon the timeshare software of their mainframe computer systems, specifically the ones known as PDP-10. Now, when the PDP-10 series became obsolete, MIT migrated to a VAX mainframe system. The problem was the timeshare software that worked with the VAX system was proprietary. Stallman could no longer do the maintenance necessary on these machines. He was no longer in a position to improve the software as he had done in the past. As a result of which, RMS basically found that his lifestyle, the life that he had come to know and love, was under jeopardy. So in reaction, he founded the Free Software Foundation in October of 1985 to, basically protect that lifestyle. He also started work on a Unix-like operating system called GNU, or GNU's not Unix, and started a license that would basically assure that the GNU operating system remained free for others to use and share. The GNU General Public License had 4 fundamental rights. The first right was the user is free to run software for any purpose. Additionally, the user is free to modify free software to suit their specific needs. The user is free to redistribute copies of free software either for no charge or for a fee. And finally, the user was free to share modified versions of free software. Now, you're probably wondering what this has to do with Linux. Well, if you remember, here we have Linus Torvalds, the creator of the Linux kernel. Linus used many of the tools from the GNU operating system to develop the Linux kernel. This included things like the Bash shell, the GNU compiler, and the Emac text editor. He also released the Linux kernel under the GNU General Public License. Now, with this being said, let's look at open source software. How does free software differ from open source software? Well, free software concerns itself with an ideology of how software should be licensed, shared, and distributed, whereas open source software concerns itself with the practical benefits of developing software in the open. The term open source software was first coined by this gentleman, Eric S. Raymond. In a Linux conference back in 1997, Raymond discussed the benefits of developing software out in the open and popularized the term open source software. He also followed up in 1998 with a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which discussed the finer points of developing in the open and with his own experiences with the SendMail client. Next, he co-founded the Open Source Initiative, an organization that is responsible for the advocacy and education surrounding open source software. And finally, he served as the OSI president up until 2005. So, what are the benefits of open source software and developing software in the open? Well, for starters, open source software is easier to audit by third parties for bugs and security flaws. Next, open source software can be contributed to by third parties. These third parties can offer security patches, they can fix bugs, they can enhance the performance of the application, and even add features to it. Since there are so many eyes on the code and there are contributions, this means that the software itself can evolve at a much faster rate than if it was developed by a small committee, by a proprietary software company. And finally, open source software can serve as the basis for an entirely new piece of software. This happens all the time whenever, a project is forked. So, once again, we're going to ask the question, what does this have to do with Linux? Well, remember, most of the software that's used in Linux distributions are available under free and open source licenses. Okay, this means that in addition to basically, the general Linux ecosystem being more secure, more performant, and more dynamic than what's commonly found with proprietary operating systems, this also means that you are given a much greater freedom of choice when you look for an operating system within the Linux ecosystem. As I said before, there are literally thousands of Linux distributions in the wild, and this is why. Now, with this being said, how to tell whether or not an application is in fact open source? Well, you can look at the specific licenses, and that's going to be your best stop right there. Right here we have a collection of some more of the more common open source licenses that you will see in the wild. We have the Mozilla Public License, we have the Apache license, the MIT license, the BSD license, and once again, we have the GNU GPL license that we spoke of earlier. But the thing that's really amazing about open source is it may have started as a Linux thing, but in recent years, we're starting to see a lot more open source applications that are available both for Mac and Windows as well. For example, here's a few applications that you might know. We have Mozilla Firefox, a very popular open source web browser. We have the Chromium web browser. Now, the Chromium web browser is based, basically, a lot of other web browsers have been based off of it. This would be a great example of software forks because you have things such as, Google's Chrome, Brave, Vivaldi, and even the new version of Microsoft's Edge browser are all based off of Chromium. We have OpenOffice or LibreOffice, which are two popular productivity suites. As a matter of fact, LibreOffice was a fork of OpenOffice after Sun Microsystems got acquired by Oracle. We also have WordPress, which is a content management system which powers about 25% of the web. And finally, OBS Studio, which is a very popular recording and streaming platform that's used by a lot of gamers and, for Twitch and YouTubers. As a matter of fact, I'm using OBS Studio right now. So, before I leave this presentation, I'm going to ask one question. What free and open source software do you use? Okay, I want you to look through your operating systems and, let me know. And feel free to share in the comments below so we can continue this discussion. Last but not least, stay tuned for this channel for the final video in this series of discovering Linux and open source, should you make the switch to Linux. Anyway, for the Linux lifestyle, my name is Michael Kornblum, encouraging you to share and like this video, subscribe to this channel, and ring the bell for future content. Be awesome to one another, folks, and hope to see you again real soon.